This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Barry Colfer, and I am the Director of Research here at the Institute of International and European Affairs in Dublin. A very warm welcome to this event on the post-legislative elections in France, what happened and what happens next. In this IIA panel discussion, our contributors will review and dissect the recent French legislative elections and will reflect on their implications. Our two experts will discuss voting trends, electoral issues, the results and possible new government, the extent to which it is possible to discuss this, and what this may mean for France's domestic and international policy. But of course, France is very important. It's important for us, important for Europe, our closest EU neighbour, as we often remind ourselves, and our friends in France. And of course, at this time of great tumult globally, looking at news very recently with President Biden stepping out of the race yesterday, it makes political developments in France and across Europe feel even more urgent for this mainly Irish audience. So I'm really delighted to be joined by our two experts on this subject. We have Dr. Elodie Fabre, who's a lecturer in politics and international studies at Queen's University Belfast. We're also joined by Mathieu Gallard, who's the research director at Ipsos France. Very broadly, Mathieu is going to speak to us first, and he will present some data and trends. So he's going to be our first speaker, and this will be followed by Elodie, who will, of course, reflect on these trends also, but we'll try and look behind them and speak a little bit about the politics before, of course, we hand over to you, our audience. I'm going to briefly introduce our two speakers and thank them before handing over, but just to get the quick reminder of housekeeping, the usual terms apply. This discussion is on the record. To participate, your audience, please use the Q&A function as usual that you'll see in front of you on your screens. Please include any affiliation if you have one when asking a question. And you can also, of course, participate in the discussion on Twitter X if you're so inclined, using the handle @IIEA. So the first person you're going to hear from in a moment is Mathieu Gallard. He's been research director at Ipsos France since 2016. Mathieu is in charge of surveys on political and electoral issues in France and abroad, and has produced analyses on these matters for numerous media and think tanks. Before joining Ipsos, Mathieu worked at the French Government Information Service, which analyzes public opinion for the Prime Minister's office. After Mathieu, I'm delighted I'll be able to hand over to Dr. Elodie Fabre. Elodie is a lecturer in politics and international studies at Queen's up in Belfast. Elodie's research focuses on political parties in France and in the UK. Elodie is currently working on the evolution of Renaissance, Emmanuel Macron's political party, and party finance in Northern Ireland, two extremely interesting and important topics. Without further ado, colleagues, you have 10 minutes each, and I'm going to hand over to Mathieu first. Now, Mathieu is going to be fiddling with the screen for a moment just to put his slides up. So if you may bear with, and I'll hand over to you then, Mathieu, whenever you're ready to go.
Thank you very much, Barry. I think it's okay, but...
Looks great. It's in...
okay.
It's still in the... Yeah, there you go. Perfect.
Okay, perfect. Let's go. Thank you very much for the invitation. I will try to give you an overview of what happened during this very, very interesting election months in France. But I think before talking about the parliamentary election, we need to go back to and it doesn't work. To the European election, which took place on the 9th of June, if I remember correctly. It's a long time ago now. A lot happened since then. But of course, it was a very interesting and very important starting point in order to explain what happened during the parliamentary election. So first, of course, during this European election, we first had a national rally, so the far-right party recording a very, very strong result with 31.4% of the votes, which was an all-time high for the party. And as you can see on the graph, which displays the results of the party for each election since its creation, European elections were actually very important for the party because in the first time the national rally was called the National Front before in the past, crossed the 10% mark. It was in the European election in 19 1984 with 10.9%. The first time the National Rally crossed the 20% mark, it was also in a European election in 2014. And the first time it crossed this 30% mark, it was this time still in an EU election. So EU elections are very, very important for this party, and we had another evidence of that last month. And what was very important also is that the geographic dominance of the party was clearly displayed on this map. First, on the left, you have the map of the vote in all the legislative constituencies of the country, and you can see that. Well, basically, you don't have much difference compared to what we had in the past. Basically, where the party was strong 20 years, 30 years ago, is still strong today. It's on the Mediterranean coast, so on the southeast of France, and on the northeast of France is quite weak still today in the large agglomerations. So, for example, Paris, Lyon, Bordeaux, Toulouse, Strasbourg, but also on the west of France, especially in Brittany, in the Loire Valley, in Normandy. But what was very important was that for the first time, the party arrived in first position in the vast majority of the constituencies. Actually, we have 577 constituencies in France, and the National Rally arrived in first position in 457 constituencies. So you can see that on the other map, and of course, it was very, very impressive. The other very important aspect of the EU election was that it was just a disaster for Emmanuel Macron's coalition. Its party, Renaissance, got only 14.6% of the votes, which is really, really catastrophic for its party. And on this graph, you have the results of the parties supporting the government in all the EU election. And you can see how bad this result, this 14.6% is. So, of course, because of the strength of the National Rally and of the weakness of the presidential coalition, it immediately raised the question about why Emmanuel Macron decided to call for a snap election after this result. And of course, I'm not Emmanuel Macron. I don't know what was in his mind, but we can imagine that the rationale behind it was just the fact that the left-wing parties were highly divided in the EU election. You can see that the Socialist Party came in first position among the left-wing party in the EU election with almost 14% of the votes, but France Insoumise, the far-left party, almost got 10%. The Green Party was a little bit higher than 5%, and the Communist Party, with only 2.4%, was still a rather important formation. So the fact that the left was totally divided was, of course, very important, quite probably in Emmanuel Macron's decision to dissolve the National Assembly, because, and we will discuss this a little bit later, basically because of the voting system in French parliamentary election, if you go divided, you will be totally decimated in the first round and not present in many constituencies in the second round. So quite probably it just saw that with the left-wing parties divided, they would not have enough time to make a coalition, which will enable its party to qualify against the National Rally in many constituencies and to benefit from a Republican front against the National Rally in the second round. But as we have seen, this is not exactly as things went during the parliamentary election. And this is where we are now. If we look at what happened during the first round, we need to discuss, of course, the main element explaining the result of the first round, which is, as I said, things didn't went as Emmanuel Macron anticipated. and the left actually very, very quickly decided to make a coalition. So the four main left-wing parties, the Socialists, the Green, the Communists, and the France Insoumise, decided to make a coalition, and it changed everything because, as you can see, the left, the total of the left-wing lists in the EU election make for 32.6% of the votes against only 14.6% for Emmanuel Macron's party, which means that with our voting system, the left was in a considerably stronger position than Emmanuel Macron's coalition. And this was very important, of course. An important aspect of the first round is the very simple fact that French people were very, very highly mobilized. This was the strongest turnout since the 97 election, as you can see on this graph. And another very important point is that the turnout was evenly distributed among the voters. It means that contrary to the EU election, where far-right voters were especially highly mobilized, it was not true in the parliamentary election. Actually, left-wing voters, centrist voters, and far-right voters all were highly mobilized and with no really differences in terms of turnout. So it was an important aspect. Another important aspect, of course, was the results, with results which were, in a way, quite different from what happened in the EU election. So first, you had the result of the National Rally and its allies, 33.3% of the votes, which was, of course, a good result. We cannot deny it. But on the other hand, it was quite less that the total result of the far right during the EU election, because you also had Reconquête, which is a party which is on the right of the National Rally, which was quite strong during the EU election with more than 5% of the votes, this time only 0.7%. And also the National Rally managed actually to split the traditional right, les Républicains, and it didn't really benefit them in terms of votes, as we can see here. So it's, of course, a very good result for the National Rally from an historical point of view, but not such a good result in order to try to get an absolute majority as the party was aiming for. For the left, it was also quite a good result because 28.5% in the first round, it means that the vast majority of the left-wing voters actually voted for this alliance, the New Popular Front, the Nouveau Front Populaire, which was a very strong success for the left because during this very short campaign, many pundits talked about the fact that it was an alliance between totally different parties and that the voters would not back this alliance. Actually, they backed it, but the fact is it was an effective alliance in order to make basically all left-wing voters voting for it, but not very effective in order to attract new voters from the center or voters abstaining in other elections. And for the centrist coalition, Ensemble, so the coalition supporting Emmanuel Macron, 21%, it's definitely better than what they get in the EU election. So it was a good result for them compared to very recent elections. But of course, from an historical point of view, it's not a very, very good result for Ensemble and Emmanuel Macron. So every party, every coalition can in a way be happy with the results of the first round, but on the other hand, no one can be very, very satisfied by it. And we can see on the map of the coalition arriving in first position in all the constituencies that the map was totally different from what we had in the EU election, with the left and also the Macronist coalition arriving in first position in actually a significant number of constituencies. What happened just after the result of the first round arrived is that the Republican Front actually made a comeback. So what is the Republican Front? It's just the tendency of the parties and of the voters to try to block the National Rally to come to power. It means that the party uh, withdraw the candidates when there is a three-way contest. So if there is a three-way contest, the party arriving in third position withdraw its candidate. And it means at the voters level that the voters tend to try to block the national rally. It was the Republican Front, something that many analysts thought was vanishing in France because it didn't work very well, and at least actually it didn't work at all during the last parliamentary election two years ago. But now the situation was, of course, totally different because for the first time it was something really possible that the national rally would govern the country after the election. So it had an impact. It had an impact on the parties, and many parties on the left, but also on the Macronist coalition, decided to withdraw their candidate arriving in third position. And you can see it in this quite complicated slide. But the main aspect is that you can see that the number of three-way contests was 306 three-way contests after the results of the first round. But actually, we had only 89 third-way contests because many candidates from the left and from the Macronist coalition decided to withdraw, and we had many more two-way contests than that we anticipated. And of course, it was not a very good news at all for the National Rally because the National Rally benefit from running against divided oppositions than more than running against a single candidate. And here you have the map of the configuration in the second round, with a vast majority of two-way contests. This is in purple, and with still a few three-way contests in orange, especially in large agglomerations around Paris, especially, and in the west and center of France, where the National Rally is quite weak and had no real chance to win the constituencies. And what was really surprising, of course, was what happened in the second round. First, the turnout in the second round was still very strong, and it was a very important evidence during the election day that the Republican Front was in place at the party level, but also at the voters level, because it just meant that many left-wing voters, when they faced in their own constituency a Macronist versus National Rally contest, they actually decided to vote. And it was exactly the same for Macronist voters when they faced in their own constituency a two-way contest between the left and the far right. So it was very important that voters stay mobilized in order to have a strong Republican front. And this is what happened. And on the voters level, we had it. We had this Republican front surging again after a very weak showing 2 years ago. So I don't want to talk about all the data here, but this is the results of a survey we have done during election day, and basically it shows that in the two-way contests between ensemble candidates, so a candidate supporting Emmanuel Macron and a National Rally candidate, 72% of the left-wing voters from the first round decided to back the ensemble candidate, which is very, very strong. So among left-wing voters, the Republican Front was really, really strong. And on the other side of the slide, you have what happened, especially for Macronist voters, what they decided to do when they were in a situation where in their constituencies there was a left-wing candidate against a National Rally candidate. If the left-wing candidate was a moderate one, a socialist one, a green one, or even a communist one, a majority of them, 54%, voted for the left-wing candidate. Only 15 voted for the National Rally candidate. But even if the left-wing candidate was a radical one from La France Insoumise, 43% of the Macronist candidate voted for the left-wing candidate against only 19% voting for the far right. So, of course, the Republican front was not as strong among centrist voters compared to left-wing voters, but it was strong. It was strong anyway, and it explains why we have this configuration in the new assembly. So, a new popular front, the left-wing coalition, with a plurality of seats, a very weak one, but a plurality anyway. A Macronist coalition with 166 seats, which was a very, very good result compared to what we could have expected when Emmanuel Macron called for the snap election. On the National Rally with 140, on its allies with 142 seats, which is, of course, a strong improvement compared to the 89 seats won in the last election, but which is also very, very, very far from the expectation because this Republican front surged between the two rounds of the parliamentary election. And now I let the floor to Elodie, who will explain to you what we can expect from this new assembly, and it's not going to be easy.
Thank you so much, Mathieu. Just before handing to you, Elodie, there's just maybe two little things I want to ask about your presentation, Mathieu, if you'll indulge me. One is a question on of data, and another one is a question on process. Just in terms of data, do we know what happened to the Reconquête vote between June and July? I mean, it's a remarkable drop from, it was 5%, I think, in the European elections to 0.7 or something. Did those supporters just drift to the other parties of the right, or can you say what may have happened?
They definitely went to the National Rally. What we have seen is that inside the Reconquête, so the party on the right of the National Rally, there was a very, very confusing situation between the European election and the first round of the parliamentary election. And actually, one of the main figures of the party is Marion Maréchal. She is a niece of Marine Le Pen. She decided to go to the National Rally to Reconquête, and actually, she decided to back the National Rally. So most of the party voters decided to vote for the National Rally candidates.
Interesting. Okay. And then my question about process is myself, many people on this call are just very interested in elections and their mechanics and how they differ and how they're similar. You drew a lot on turnout. Turnout was obviously relatively high. Is there anything that explains that beyond the very obvious? And you can say no, if it's just because this election was very important and people were more felt the urgency, perhaps that, or was there something driving it or something organized to try and improve turnout? And kind of similarly, something that was really fascinating was this Republican front. You dwelt on this very clearly in your presentation, where there was the three ways that many candidates stepped out so as to avoid splitting the non-right-wing vote, let's call it. Similarly, did that emerge kind of organically, or were there any figures in French politics within the parties that were particularly important in bringing about what seems to have been a very kind of successful move for the parties of the non-right?
Okay, regarding the turnout, I think, well, basically, you said it. Voters just felt that for the first time since a long time, there was a lot at stake in this parliamentary election. You know, since 2002, each parliamentary election in France is organized just after a presidential election. And many voters just think about this kind of election as a confirmation election, which means that basically the new president will have a majority. So there is not a lot at stake. For the first time since more than 25 years, the election was organized in the middle of a presidential terms. And of course, there was a lot at stakes. First, which party will govern the country after the election? And even more importantly, will the National Rally be in a position to govern the party after the election? It was, of course, something that mobilized a lot, very strongly, actually, National Rally voters, but it was also something that mobilized voters who were afraid of the perspective of the National Rally governing the country. So it explains why the turnout rise in a similar proportion among every categories of the population, basically. Regarding the Republican Front, it's something that is organized. You can, well, theoretically, you can have a Republican Front without party organizing it, but it's really, really difficult to imagine. So you need to have candidates or parties in third position withdrawing their candidates. And this is something that happened very, very quickly and very, very clearly on the left. The dynamic was clearly more difficult among the Macronist coalition, with, for example, some leaders, for example, Edouard Philippe, the former prime minister, saying that, yeah, they accept to withdraw their candidates, but not when the candidate opposing the National Front is a far-left candidate. Some others were a little bit more clear, even if it took a few days. For example, Gabriel Attal, the prime minister, actually, he decided to say clearly that even if the left-wing candidate is a far-left candidate, the party needed to withdraw the candidate in this case. So it needs to happen on the party levels, and I think the message of the leaders was very important in order to make it happen on the voters level. But it's true that it was a little bit surprising how strong it was, especially among left-wing voters, if you consider all the tensions, and this is not the accurate word, between the left and the presidential coalition in the last 2 years.
Very clear, Mathieu. Thank you very much. Elodie, I'm delighted to hand you the floor. By all means, please make your presentation, but if you have any comments or thoughts on what Mathieu has shared with us as well, please fire ahead. Thank you, Elodie.
Okay, thank you. Well, while I'm presenting, I would also say that on the Republican front, left voters have actually more of a track record of it. They're more used to voting for candidates they might not support in order to prevent the election of a National Rally candidate. They've done that as far back as 2002, when Jacques Chirac ended up against Jean-Marie Le Pen in the presidential elections. And again, every time Marine Le Pen has been in the second round of presidential elections, it was against either a right-wing candidate or indeed against Emmanuel Macron. So they've got a lot more practice of voting for someone from the other side than Emmanuel Macron's voters, or some of them, and voters on the right who've not had to do this sort of electoral gymnastic. Okay, so I'm going sort of to follow up on what Mathieu was saying. And so we kind of had the same starting point here, which was, are you also seeing the closed captions?
The closed captions, yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
No problem.
I'm not entirely sure how to stop them. That's my problem here, but
I'll leave that to the tech team actually looking. Are they bothering you, Elodie?
No, it's just surprising me. But if it's not a bother to you, I will.
Not at all. No,
that's the thing with recording lectures and things like that. You need to have closed captions for students.
No, it's great.
Yes, apologies. I can't seem to know how to remove them.
Leave them rolling. It's fine. Honestly,
okay,
you have them on anyway.
Yes. So yeah, so that's the same starting point as Mathieu, which is showing you the evolution of the previous election. So that's the 2022 parliamentary elections and the 2024 EP elections and the state of the party. So there's no point elaborating further on this because Mathieu has done this, but this shows that indeed, as Mathieu was saying, Macron sort of gambled on the divisions of the right, and that hasn't quite worked as well as he expected. So Macron's party, which is now called Renaissance after having been called En Marche and then La République En Marche. Now it's called Renaissance, but it's mostly now in coalition with a few other parties, and they're called Ensemble, Together for the Republic seems to be the new name. It keeps changing all the time. It's driving me nuts a little bit. But in 2022, they had a narrow majority of the seats in Parliament. But they were still quite difficult sometimes to pass legislation. They quite regularly had to use Article 49.3 of the Constitution, which allows a bill to be passed without a vote if Parliament fails to pass a motion against the government. And that created a lot of tensions because they really failed to try. They could not often find ways to increase the size of their majority and get legislation through. So that was also a source of frustration for that majority. But obviously, the hope from Macron was to increase the size of their majority, which they've really not done. They've lost a lot of seats, as you can see here. You can see the United Left previously was called the New Union. Oh, sorry, I can't remember the mental translation right now, but it was the Popular and Ecologic Union of the Left. Now they're called the New Popular Front. And they saw an increase in the number of seats, and also the National Rally increased its seats. The fourth bloc in French politics is the sort of mainstream right. The mainstream right has really suffered in this particular election because the party leader, Éric Ciotti, who was at the right of the party, decided to join forces with the National Rally. And the rest of the party, or most of the rest of the party, refused that alliance, which led to some absurd situations when we had the party leader locking himself in his office, the rest of the party trying to remove him from his position, but actually the statutes do not allow them to do this. But so the Les Républicains are now divided between a small group led by Éric Ciotti, who have a few seats in Parliament thanks to an agreement with the National Rally. And the rest of Les Républicains have 46 seats. And they're very much squeezed in a small space between the National Rally and Macron's party. So this is what the new assembly looks like. And so what you see here is that everything between the dark red and the dark green is that new Popular Front. The Macron alliance is the sort of gold yellow to the sort of first shades of lightish blue. The darkest blue is Les Républicains, so that sort of post-Gaullist right. And the grey and black are the National Rally, and those on the right who are aligned with the National Rally. And so this looks like this, and we're very much in a sort of three-block situation right now. And so if I've added as well comparisons with 2017, so you can see how much that Macronist bloc has shrunk. They've nearly lost half of their seats. And you could see as well how on the left that coalition strategy that Mathieu was talking about earlier has worked very well for them, because in 2017 there were really a small group of MPs that increased in 2022 when they formed an electoral coalition, and when they renewed that electoral coalition this year, that worked well as well. You can also see how much the National Rally has grown in Parliament between 2017 and 2024. That's what the Parliament looks like now, and this three block make it very, very difficult to consider how we're going to make a coalition. So who governs? Right now, it's still Gabriel Attal, who looks like he's aged quite a lot in the 6 months he's been prime minister. But so as soon as the elections results were known after the second round, he presented his government's resignation to the president, who initially refused it, so that they kept going. But last week, Parliament returned, and then the president accepted the government's resignation, but they still stay in place because there's no alternative yet. So it's a situation that's very unfamiliar to the French, but it's very familiar to any parliamentary democracy that is used to coalition government. Well, it might take a bit of time between the election and the moment when the parties in parliament manage to find a governing agreement. So we have a sort of caretaker government that can just keep things running. They can't make any new decision. They can't introduce bills into parliament, etc. They keep things ticking along until there's actually a government. It looks like Macron is arguing that no new government should be appointed until after the Olympic Games. If I've got my calendar right, they run until sometime mid-August. I apologize, I haven't been paying that much attention to the Olympics. But what I do know is that there are also Paralympic Games after that. So is that taking us to no new government until mid-August or until actually early September? That remains to be seen because it's not clear what the president wants here. But some new government needs to happen. So there's been a lot of talk of having a left-wing minority government. And as you can see, that's that block that goes from that dark red color to that light pink color that includes a few communists. The LFI is Jean-Luc Mélenchon's Radical Left Party, and pink is the Socialist Party, and green is Europe Écologie Les Verts, so the Green Party. There are also a few unaffiliated left-wingers in there who have since joined some of the parliamentary groups in here. But altogether, they make up about, I was looking earlier, that's 223 members of parliament. And, well, that's still 66 short of a majority in parliament. And it's unlikely that there's enough potential available votes, even on a bill-by-bill basis, in the rest of Parliament to really sustain such a coalition. And there's also an issue right now, which is that since the election, the left-wing parties have been talking a lot to each other to discuss who might be their candidate for prime minister. A whole number of names have been proposed and variously rejected by other members of that coalition. Typically, whoever LFI suggests end up being rejected by the socialists. Whoever the socialists propose ends up being rejected by LFI. So that's one big issue right now, is who might they agree to present as a candidate. The other issue is, should they come to having a candidate and should the president appoint this person as prime minister? It's quite unclear how they would get their legislative agenda in place. A second one, so one coalition that has a majority and that is very much favored by Macron and others, might be one that includes pretty much all the parties that you can see linked here together, perhaps with the exception of the Greens. The Home Secretary really does not like the Greens and would not like them to be in coalition with Renaissance, but that would include the Socialists, some of the moderate on the left, but also then go all the way to Les Républicains. There are a few issues with this potential coalition. One, there's no real evidence at this stage that the socialists have any intention of breaking away from that left-wing coalition. To a degree, this coalition would really make Ensemble the core of that coalition. And therefore, that would be the largest group and would really be in the driver's seat of any such coalition. It's hard to see why the Socialist Party, who Macron has done his best over the last 7 years to undermine, maybe make that 8 years at least, to undermine, why they would want to save his skin right now. Another hurdle in this big coalition here is that Les Républicains have said, we don't want to be part of a coalition. We could be part of a legislative agreement of sort of confidence and supply to a minority government where we would have an agreement. We would not be part of that government. Another risk of such a coalition is that it's pretty much everyone but the extremes, and in particular, everyone but the National Rally. And that would really play into the hand of Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella, who've been arguing that for decades that there's a sort of cartel against the National Rally, and before that, the National Front. And that Republican Front is for them some evidence of this cartel, even though it's actually citizens voting against the National Rally. But that would really, that sort of coalition would kind of really strengthen the hand of the National Rally, or their argument that they're the only real opposition. And we see them saying this already, because this week there have been internal elections in Parliament for the Speaker, the Bureau of the Assembly, etc. And unlike in 2022, they did not get any vice presidency, etc. And so they're arguing that, look, everyone else is voting against us again. We are the only opposition. So what does that mean for our institutions? Those institutions have been built for majority governments, really. The idea that, you've got a president who's elected by citizens, and then they will have support from a parliamentary majority, and that implement their program. We've had instances where this has not worked out as planned. We call that coalition, where Mitterrand had 2 right-wing prime ministers, and Chirac had 1 socialist prime minister. But in every instance, the government had the support of a parliamentary majority. Since 2022, we've had minority governments, and the logics of partisanship that remain very strong in France mean that they've really struggled to find broader agreements, even on a bill-by-bill basis, to build majorities, and therefore they've had to use that Article 49.3 that I was saying about, that allows a bill to pass without a vote unless Parliament votes the government out. And those institutions influence parliamentary politicians' behavior as well, and that creates a lack. There's no culture of consensus in French politics. And we see that in some of those discussions on the left, for instance, who say, well, we're going to form a government and we will implement our program, just our program and nothing but our program. But there's no parliamentary majority for that program. And so and then you see as well the right saying, well, we will support you on a one-to-one basis, but it depends, because they're also thinking of 2027 and the presidential election, and then you need to maintain your separate identities to have your own candidate. So what all this means that it's going to be very difficult, and it is quite possible that Mathieu and me and some of us, some of you perhaps in the audience, will be voting against in a parliamentary election in a year's time. There cannot be a new election for a year after the snap election, but they could well be one after June of 2025. Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.